Hi, this is Kevin Turner from Spanish River High School in Boca Raton, Florida, here with topic 1.7, Regional Analysis on AP Daily. What are we going to learn in this video? So when we think about regions, there are different ways that geographers will describe regions and define regions. But the one thing that's always going to be the same is that a region is going to be based on a set of distinctive common characteristics or an activity. So generally, when we think of regions, we think of them as having a core area where that phenomenon is dominant. And then it'll go to being prevalent, where it's kind of the majority. And then it'll be present. And then finally, as you escape the region and get outside of it, it's going to be completely absent. So one thing to just remember, all regions are going to have that common characteristic or that common activity. But there are three kinds of regions that we want you to know about. The first are what we call formal regions. And all of these regions are going to have AKAs. And I want you to really kind of remember these AKAs because it will really help you with the definitions when you're thinking about which region is which. Formal, I want you to think about the word uniform. You may even see a word like homogeneous, right? Meaning the same. When you think about a uniform, the Yankees and their pinstripes, they all look the same. When you go to a formal event, men might be wearing a tuxedo and they all look the same. So when we think about a formal region, I want you to think about regions that have some unifying characteristic. It could be a human characteristic, it could be a physical characteristic, but something's going to be the same. And then we're going to think about functional regions. Now here, it's not something inside the region that's the same, it's an activity. It's some sort of networked transportation or communication-based activity. Sometimes they'll call this a nodal region. A node is a hub of something or a focal point. You can even sometimes, when you're getting sick, you feel up under your neck and you have these nodes that get all swollen, lymph nodes, because they're helping the body fight off infection. Right? So a nodal activity is a functional, right, region. And so what we see is that that node will be the center, or like I said, the hub of that activity. And then you can see the extent of the activity, and where the activity is no longer being done, then you know you're no longer in that functional region. The third kind of region that we can sometimes have is what we call a perceptual region. And this is sometimes AKA a vernacular region. And the reason why they call it perceptual or vernacular is because each person kind of ultimately makes their own decisions about it. Perception is in your mind. So there may be characteristics that you perceive define that region. And generally speaking, people will agree, but not always. Because it's up to every person's individualized perception, the boundaries of these kinds of regions might be what we call fuzzy, right? They're not precise, like a formal region is going to be really precise. The perceptual region is going to be up to debate, right? And if you think about when we talk about the topic and the skills that we want you to be thinking about with regions, one thing we want you to realize is that regions are oftentimes contested and overlapping, particularly these perceptual kinds of regions, right? So let's think about some examples. And instead of doing a bunch of images here, I wanted to show you basically just ways that we can conceptualize regions both in real life and perceptually as well. And first, when we think about formal, remember we said that there has to be some unifying characteristic. So think about California wine country, right? That's a formal region. There's a definite boundary, right, within which California is producing a lot of grapes to make wine. How do you know you're no longer in that wine region? Well, you don't see the vineyards anymore. You don't see the grapes, right? But if you're in the middle of Napa or Sonoma County, where a lot of California wine production is taking place, you can see vineyards for as far as you can see. There's literally nothing but grapes on the valley floor and up onto the hillsides and the mountainsides. So that's an example of a formal region where something is the same. Where I work here in the school district of Palm Beach County, we have a uniformity of school board policies, attendance policies, grading policies, disciplinary policies, right? The pay scale is the same for all the teachers. The schools all operate using the same, physical plant, right? The same billing systems, the same accounting paperwork. All of that's the same within the school district of Palm Beach County, which will be different than Broward County, right? Which is the county next door. Another example of a formal region, the province of Quebec in Canada, right? It's this island of French in a sea of English of North America, but it's retained that Quebecois culture, right? That makes them unique and distinct and different, right? So let's think of some functional regions. I came up with a few for you here. I like to fly a lot, to travel. And of course, when you fly, you almost always have to change planes, right? You have to fly to one airport and then switch to a different flight. That's because airlines figured out a long time ago that it was very cost effective for them to develop a hub and spoke system where you fly into that hub and then you connect and go somewhere else. It's more efficient for them. Well, that's a good example of functional regions, right? Because there's a transportation network that's linking, right? Say Atlanta or Dallas, Fort Worth, Chicago, O'Hare. These are big hubs in America. Everybody flies in and out of those hubs and then switches to planes to their ultimate destination. Another example of a functional region might be when you call for food delivery. And you may call for pizza or you may call for Chinese takeout. And they may sometimes say to you, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't deliver to you. Your house is not in our delivery area," right? Because that delivery area is a functional region, right? It's a networked area of transportation for the delivery drivers. You can even map a pattern for commuters, people who live in the suburbs and drive downtown to go to their job, and the highways that they take or the roadways that they take. Could be mass transit, could be the bus, could be the subway, could be an elevated train. The reality is, though, that again, that is a network, all right, a node, a function that's taking place within that functional region. The downtown area would be the hub or the node of that. And then we think about perceptual regions, the last of the three. And I gave you one example here as the South. And you could do this with a lot of different regions in the United States, the Midwest, and those kinds of places where the boundaries there are not so perfectly defined. Because what characteristics are we going to use to label the South? There could be a bunch. People watch NASCAR races. People tend to be Baptist Christians. It doesn't get very cold. The South is going to be maybe states that historically were part of the Confederacy. There's a lot of different ways that we could, define the limitations of this region. So therefore, it's a great example of a perceptual region where everybody's boundaries are a little bit different. If you gave a map of the United States to a bunch of people and said, draw a big circle around the South, what you'd find out is that not everybody's circle around the South would be exactly the same diameter, the same size, right? And that's exactly what we mean by perceptual regions. So let's practice. I found a couple of questions, and this is going to be interesting because both questions kind of ask the same thing, but in a different way. So I want to walk you through this, right? And I think this will be fun for you. A formal region defines an area in which, so pretty much our vocab word here, straight up definition. What is a formal region? And we have choices here: core, dominating, and surrounding hinterland. Remember, we did talk about cores, and there's a dominant area, and then prevalent, and then present and absent. Transportation network, uniformity of physical human characteristics, significant geographic variations in characteristics, unified government system. Notice that there are some great distractors here. In E, they've got the word unified, but it's only governmental, right? A formal region could be more than just government. It could be language, it could be religion, it could be a lot of things, right? The core dominating the surrounding hinterland also sounds really, really good, but it leaves out all of the other levels there. And it's definitely not B, the transportation network, because that's definitely a functional or a nodal region. So what we're going to look for is we're going to look at C, right? Because it's got uniformity in one or more human or physical characteristics, right? And that's what we want you to remember: formal, AKA uniform. It definitely helps you to get that question right. Now, a similar question asked in a little bit of a different way. A formal cultural region differs from other regions in that it what, right? How is it different? So now it's kind of approaching it from a different angle. But again, look at your answer choices. Look at A, it has a focal point or a node. If you remember that your functional region is a nodal region, you know that it can't be A. B says it's one that people believe exists. There's your perceptual region right there. So we know that it can't be B. Look at C. We like C already. It's got a selected feature or an internal uniformity. Remember, formal, AKA uniform. D says it does not have gradations like the core, the domain, the sphere. Well, that's exactly what we were talking about. It does. It has an area that kind of decreasing as you go outward from the center of the region. And again, it says it applies to only linguistic or religious. We know that it could be a lot of things. It could be religious, it could be linguistic, it could be governmental, it could be a lot of things. But the best answer again here is C. Okay? So, what should we take away from this particular video about regions? Well, regionalization is something that you're kind of already familiar with because I'm pretty sure in science class, you've learned about classifying animals based on characteristics. You know, are they amphibians? Are they reptiles? Are they mammals? Are they vertebrates? Are they invertebrates? You know, all the different genus and species and kingdom and phylum and order and class. Well, guess what? That's what we're doing as geographers too. We're taking bigger parts of the earth and we're chunking them down into smaller pieces to make it easier to observe, to make it easier to look for, you guessed it, patterns and processes. Have you ever heard me say that before? So that's what we're doing as geographers is we're chunking into regions to make it easier to look for those spatial relationships. So the next time you're thinking about it, ask yourself, what is the characteristic? What is the activity if it's a functional region? What are the things that are making this place distinct and unique so that we can label them as regions? Thanks for watching. We'll look for you next time on AP Daily. Hi, this is Kevin Turner from Spanish River High School in Boca Raton, Florida. And here we are in topic 1.7, regional analysis for AP Daily, the last video in topic 1.7. What are we going to learn? So we talked about regions in the first video, and the purpose of the second video is to focus in on the overlapping nature of how regions are thought of or processed here in human geography. And that's because of the defining characteristics, a particular place may fit into more than one region. The boundaries may overlap a little bit. And sometimes people can actually argue or debate about the inclusion of a place into either this region or that region based on those characteristics. This is especially true when we're thinking about those perceptual regions that we talked about that everybody kind of defines individually based on their own thinking. But when geographers are thinking regionally, the big takeaway is that they are chunking down and zooming into smaller areas geographically so that they can look for those spatial relationships and those patterns and processes. So when we think about regional analysis, we could be looking at a local area. We could be looking at a part of a state, like part of, Colorado. We could say we're looking at part of Canada, or we could say we're looking at part of Latin America. That's the thing about regions that's really kind of cool, is that it allows us to zoom in and zoom out and to change our scale of analysis so that we're looking at different size places, all of which could be described as being regional. So let's look at an example. In the old course description for human geography, they used to have these really kind of cool maps that took the earth and broke it down into these, subcategories that we would call regions. But these are like global regions, big, huge areas of landmass. Obviously, North America, South America, you could see those continental names, and you're somewhat familiar with that. But I also want to point out to you that things like sub-Saharan Africa, right? Africa below the Sahara Desert. We can look at these places and say that these are huge areas where, generally speaking, there are going to be commonalities. But one thing about regions that's important is, again, when you change scale, you're going to notice that those loose commonalities aren't always going to be true anymore, because every time we chunk into smaller regions, there's going to be common characteristics that define those smaller pieces. And I'll show you an example. If you change the map and you zoom in another layer and you say, okay, well, let's take that North America and let's break it up. Or if we take, say, Africa, even sub-Saharan Africa, and break it up, we're going to end up with our West Africa piece, or Central Africa piece, East Africa piece, Southern Africa. Don't call it South Africa because that's a whole country, Southern Africa. These areas are going to be different, whether it's linguistically, other types of cultural differences, right? Could be climatic differences as well. So this is where you see that every time we zoom, we're going to change a little bit about what we're analyzing geographically in terms of those spatial patterns and processes. Also look at, say, Latin America, right? Latin America is kind of an umbrella terminology there. All of these places make up a Latin-based part of America. But notice that Brazil, while being Latin, doesn't speak Spanish. Therefore, it kind of gets shunted into its own region by itself, being Portuguese-based linguistically, right? So you can see basically from the US-Mexico border, you've got that Latin American culture that extends all the way down to the bottom of South America. Right? So definitely take a look at these two images. Perhaps this is a great discussion to have in class with your teacher about how you break these regions down and what are the commonalities that would make, say, Eastern Europe different from Western Europe, right? Now, let's change scale again. Let's look at just the United States. And this is something that I think students really have to practice a little bit because, you know, geographic education in our country hasn't always been one of the biggest priorities. It should be, but think about the United States. Here we have the lower 48 contiguous states. We've got Alaska and Hawaii down there. Again, I have a very good friend that teaches in Alaska. Does not like at all the fact that Alaska is often shown there off the bottom of Mexico somewhere because, you know, there are some kids that probably think, hey, that's where Alaska belongs instead of way, way up there in beyond Washington state. But when we look at the United States, it would be very easy to draw two down and dirty lines and say, oh, look, we're going to divide the United States into regions. We got a Northwest, a Southwest, and a Northeast, and a Southeast. I wish I could tell you it works like that. But generally speaking, most Americans are going to tell you, okay, we have a West, we have a Midwest, we have a South, and we have a North, right? Those are big regional chunks of our country. But what if we wanted to maybe go one level even more, right? We could talk about the Pacific Northwest. They sometimes call that Cascadia. You could talk about the Mountain West, right? The Rocky Mountain area. We could talk about the Great Plains, right? The kind of flat rectangular states that we generally fly across when we live on the East Coast and the West Coast, right? You could talk about the Middle Atlantic states. You could talk about New England, right? And certainly you could see how these regions zoom in a bit. And again, you're going to get different characteristics, right? So every time you talk about regions, there can be overlaps, there can be contested, assignments, should they be part of this region or that? You start getting up there into kind of northern Kentucky, southern Ohio, southern Indiana, you're on that border between the North and the South kind of thing. But you're going to notice that those are areas that are sometimes blended in terms of that identity. One thing that I can also tell you, living here in Florida for as long as I have, is, you could do the same thing with your state. And again, this might be something really fun to do with your teacher in your classroom, is to break your state down and say, well, what are the regional affiliations that we generally assign? If you talk to most Floridian kids, they'll tell you, okay, there's a panhandle, right? The Florida panhandle. You've got a North Florida. You have a Florida Gulf Coast region. You have Central Florida. You have South Florida. And we can certainly break the state up that way. But remember what I said about overlapping and sometimes contested? So think about this. Where is the University of South Florida? Now look where I just drew that circle. And then let me tell you, the University of South Florida is in Tampa. I'm not real sure geographically why they decided that that was going to be where the University of South Florida was going to be. University of Central Florida, definitely in Central Florida. It's in Orlando. University of North Florida, University of West Florida. Florida Gulf Coast is in the Gulf Coast region. All of the other ones generally make sense. I've never really understood why the University of South Florida is in Tampa. But this is what I mean by overlapping and sometimes contested. So let's practice. Right now, this is a bit of a challenging question because this is a little bit out of nowhere. Right, all of the following arguments are cited by critics of megastores. You might ask, well, what's a megastore? These big box retailers that are like category killers. They sell one kind of thing and they dominate that particular type of commercial activity, like a Bass Pro Shop or a Super Walmart or the big warehouse superstores. Those are megastores. So, what would some of the critics say about those? That they destroy locally owned stores, they homogenize the landscape. In other words, they make it look all the same. They increase traffic and congestion. They conform to the distinctiveness of the region. They're outsiders who have no stake in the community. All of these are criticisms except, right? So we're looking for the one thing that's really not a criticism. We'll take a look. Conforming to the distinctiveness of the region. All right, the region's going to have distinct characteristics that are going to make it different from the other places around it. The mega store is going to be the same all across the country. It's going to look the same. It's going to sell the same products. It's going to have the same kind of a mission, right? So this is where you see, oh, they don't, right? They don't have that same characteristic as the region. That's why that's going to be the answer D there. Okay. So what should we take away from this lesson? Human geography topics and skills. We've talked about so much in these first few videos. Both Ms. Neurath and I have covered a lot of topics and a lot of skills, and you've learned a lot, right? Let's simplify a bit. Let's say that at least you should be able to take away the idea that this class is all about patterns and processes, and that you're using those 5 key kind of verbs that you can identify, you can define, you can describe, you can explain, and you can compare when it comes to those patterns and processes. If you're doing that, of course, you're thinking like a geographer, and you've heard me say that to you as well. I want you to think about thinking like a geographer as you go through these videos all year long, right? And ask yourself the where, the why there, and why care. Right? Coming up as you get into Unit 2, which is Population and Migration Patterns and Processes, Ms. Neurath will be joined by my friend, Mr. Hill from Texas. I know that you will be excited to continue watching these videos with them, and we look forward to seeing you the next time on AP Daily. Thank you for watching.